In the autumn of 1941, as leaves turned to ash and the earth hardened under the first touch of frost, the greatest army the world had ever seen stood at the gates of Moscow. Behind them lay a trail of conquered nations. Poland crushed in weeks, France humbled in 40 days, the Balkans subdued in a spring campaign that felt more like a parade than a war. The Wehrmacht had become a myth made flesh, an unstoppable force that had rewritten the rules of modern warfare. And now, after 5 months of relentless advance across the endless Russian steppe, after capturing millions of Soviet soldiers and destroying thousands of tanks, after covering more ground than Napoleon ever dreamed possible, they could see the spires of the Kremlin rising through the morning mist. Moscow lay before them like a wounded animal, surrounded, desperate, ready to fall. Or so they believed. What the German soldiers could not see, what their maps could not show, and their intelligence could not fathom, was that they were not standing at the threshold of victory. They were standing at the edge of an abyss that would swallow armies whole and break the back of the Reich itself. The battle for Moscow would not be decided by tactics or technology, or the brilliance of generals. It would be decided by something far more primal, the capacity of human beings to endure beyond all reason, to fight when fighting makes no sense, to survive when survival seems impossible. This is the story of why Moscow did not fall, and what that refusal cost the German Reich. Not in statistics or strategy alone, but in blood and frost, and the slow realization that some things, once begun, cannot be stopped until they have consumed everything. The plan had been perfect. Operation Barbarossa, named after the medieval emperor who led the First Crusade, was designed to shatter the Soviet Union in a single summer campaign. 3 million German soldiers, supported by Romanian, Hungarian, Finnish, and Italian allies, would strike across a front stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea. Army Group North would take Leningrad, Army Group South would seize Ukraine's breadbasket and the oil fields of the Caucasus, and Army Group Center, the hammer of the offensive, would smash through Belarus and drive straight for Moscow. The Soviet capital would fall before the leaves turned, and with it would collapse Stalin's entire regime. Hitler had told his generals they needed only to kick in the door, and the whole rotten structure would come crashing down. For the first months, reality seemed to validate this arrogance. The initial German assault on June 22nd in 1941 achieved complete tactical surprise. Soviet forward units were annihilated before they could even understand they were at war. Entire air regiments were destroyed on the ground, their planes lined up neatly for inspection when the bombs fell. Mechanized columns raced forward, encircling Soviet armies in vast pockets that would each yield hundreds of thousands of prisoners. At Minsk, at Smolensk, at Kiev, the pattern repeated with industrial efficiency. The Red Army fought with desperate courage, throwing themselves at German positions in human waves that accomplished nothing but their own destruction. Soviet tanks, inferior in design and tactics, burned by the hundreds. Soviet generals, paralyzed by Stalin's purges and terrified of showing initiative, made decisions that turned battles into massacres. By September, Army Group Center had pushed to within 200 miles of Moscow. The path seemed open, but already something was wrong. The Germans had expected a sprint and found themselves in a marathon. Soviet resistance, though often suicidal and poorly coordinated, never broke completely. New armies appeared where intelligence had promised none existed. Factories beyond the Urals, unknown to German planners, began producing tanks and planes to replace those destroyed. The distances themselves became an enemy. Supply lines stretched across hundreds of miles of primitive roads that turned to mud with every rain. Trucks broke down, horses died by the thousands, and the advance, while still moving forward, began to slow. Then, Hitler made his fateful choice. Against the advice of his generals, who pleaded to strike directly at Moscow while momentum remained, he ordered Army Group Center to divert south to complete the encirclement of Kiev. The military logic was sound. Destroy the Soviet forces in Ukraine, secure the industrial and agricultural resources of the south. But it cost time. Precious weeks passed, while the greatest concentration of German armor wheeled away from the Soviet capital. When the assault on Moscow finally resumed in early October, renamed Operation Typhoon, autumn had arrived, And with autumn came the rasputitsa, the season of mud. The Russian earth itself turned against the invaders. Roads dissolved into rivers of black muck that swallowed vehicles whole. Tanks that had crossed Europe in weeks now struggled to move a mile in a day. Soldiers who had marched across France singing now staggered forward through knee-deep slime, their boots disintegrating, their summer uniforms offering no protection against the October cold that arrived earlier and harder than any German meteorologist had predicted. Still, they advanced because the German army did not know how to do anything else. They had been forged in victory after victory, and the muscle memory of conquest drove them forward, even as logic began to whisper that this was different. Inside Moscow, Stalin made his own decision. The Soviet government evacuated to Kuibyshev, hundreds of miles to the east. Archives were packed, ministries relocated, diplomatic staff sent to safety. But Stalin himself remained. On November 7th, with German forces less than 50 miles away and artillery fire audible in the suburbs, he stood atop Lenin's mausoleum in Red Square and watched the annual Revolution Day parade. Soldiers marched through the snow in full battle dress, then turned from the parade ground and headed directly to the front lines. The symbolism was unmistakable. Moscow would fight. More than that, Stalin's presence declared that the Soviet state still functioned, still had a will, still believed in something beyond mere survival. What Stalin believed in was as brutal as it was effective. Behind every Soviet unit stood NKVD blocking detachments with orders to shoot anyone who retreated without permission. Commanders who failed were executed, their families arrested. Entire ethnic groups suspected of potential disloyalty were deported en masse to Kazakhstan and Siberia. The Soviet system had always been merciless, but now that mercilessness was directed outward with singular focus. If the Germans wanted Moscow, they would have to pay for every street in blood. If they wanted the Soviet Union, they would find that its people would rather burn their own homes than surrender them. Stalin understood that in a total war between two totalitarian systems, victory would belong not to the side with better tanks or braver soldiers, but to the side that could endure more suffering. The Germans did not understand this until they were already caught in the trap. Throughout November, as temperatures plunged and the first real snows began to fall, they continued their methodical advance. Their tactical superiority remained evident. German units consistently outfought Soviet forces of equal or greater size. But tactical victories no longer translated to strategic success. Every Soviet position destroyed was replaced by another. Every mile gained stretched supply lines further. And the cold, the terrible cold that came earlier and harder than any living German had experienced, began to exact a toll that no amount of military skill could overcome. The temperature dropped to 20 degrees below zero, then 30, then 40. German vehicles, designed for European warfare, froze solid overnight. Engine oil turned to sludge. Hydraulic fluid in artillery pieces crystallized, rendering guns useless. Machine guns jammed after firing a few rounds because the metal contracted in the cold. But these mechanical failures, devastating as they were, paled beside what the frost did to human flesh. German soldiers, still wearing the summer uniforms they had invaded in because the winter supplies were stuck somewhere back along those endless supply lines, began to freeze. Not just to feel cold, but to literally freeze. Fingers and toes turning black with frostbite, limbs requiring amputation, soldiers found dead at their posts with no wounds, simply claimed by the winter night. The Soviet soldiers were cold too, desperately cold, but they had winter uniforms. They had felt-lined boots instead of the thin leather that German soldiers wrapped in newspaper and straw, trying to preserve their feet. They had white camouflage that made them invisible in the snow, while German field grey stood out like targets. Most importantly, they were defending their capital, their homes, fighting with the knowledge that surrender meant slavery or death, while the Germans were 3,000 kilometers from home, wondering what they were still doing in this frozen hell. By early December, German spearheads had pushed to within 12 miles of the Kremlin. Reconnaissance units reported they could see the spires of Moscow's cathedrals through their binoculars. They were so close. But close means nothing when you cannot move forward. The German advance had not been stopped by any single Soviet victory or brilliant counterattack. It had simply ground to a halt, exhausted, frozen, bled out by 1,000 small battles and the relentless mathematics of attrition. Divisions that had begun the campaign with 15,000 men now counted 3,000 effectives. Panzer divisions that had started with 200 tanks now had 20 or 30 still running. And the Soviets kept attacking, kept probing, kept applying pressure to a front that had no reserves left. Then, on December 5th, 1941, while the world's attention focused on the Pacific, where Japan was about to strike Pearl Harbor, the Red Army launched its winter counteroffensive. Fresh Siberian divisions, equipped and trained for winter warfare, struck from multiple directions at once. These were not the conscript armies the Germans had been destroying for months. These were professional soldiers, many veterans of combat against the Japanese in 1939, men who knew how to fight in conditions that immobilized their enemies. They hit German positions that could barely move, whose heavy weapons were frozen solid, whose soldiers were as concerned with staying alive through the night as with fighting. The German retreat from Moscow was not the orderly withdrawal of a professional army. It was a catastrophe barely contained by desperate courage and iron discipline. Units dissolved into mobs of frostbitten men, stumbling westward, abandoning vehicles and heavy equipment, fighting not to hold ground, but simply to escape encirclement. Soviet cavalry, moving easily through snow that German motorized units could not navigate, ranged behind German lines, cutting off retreat routes. Entire German divisions ceased to exist, not destroyed in battle, but scattered across the frozen landscape, their soldiers either captured or dead in the snow. Hitler, safely ensconced in his headquarters in East Prussia, responded with characteristic rigidity. He issued his famous Stand Fast order, forbidding any withdrawal, regardless of circumstances. Generals who argued for tactical retreats to defensible positions were dismissed. Field Marshal von Bock, commander of Army Group Center, was relieved of command. Field Marshal von Brauchitsch, commander-in-chief of the German army, was dismissed, and Hitler assumed direct command himself. The message was clear. There would be no retreat, no acknowledgement that the campaign had failed. The German army would hold its positions through the winter and resume the offensive in spring. The Stand Fast order probably prevented the retreat from becoming a complete rout, but its cost was staggering. German units that might have withdrawn to defensible positions instead stood and died where they were. Small towns and villages that could have been abandoned became death traps where German garrisons were besieged, supplied only by air, gradually worn down by cold and combat. The entire system of German military professionalism, which had emphasized flexibility and tactical initiative, was subordinated to Hitler's will. From this moment forward, the German army would increasingly become an instrument of Nazi ideology rather than military logic. By the time the Soviet winter offensive exhausted itself in January 1942, Army Group Center had been pushed back between 100 and 200 miles across its entire front. 300,000 German soldiers were casualties, killed, wounded, captured, or invalids from frostbite. The losses in equipment were catastrophic, impossible to fully replace. But more important than the material losses was what had been shattered in the German soul. The myth of invincibility was dead. The German army had been defeated, driven back by an enemy that Nazi ideology had declared racially inferior and militarily incompetent. Every German soldier now knew that this war would not end with a triumphant parade through Moscow. If it ended at all, it would end with blood and exhaustion measured in years, not months. For the Soviet Union, the cost of saving Moscow was almost beyond comprehension. Soviet casualties in 1941 exceeded 3 million dead and another 3 million captured. Entire regions had been depopulated. The industrial heartland of Ukraine was under occupation. Leningrad was under siege, beginning a 900-day ordeal that would claim 1 million civilian lives through starvation and bombardment. The demographic catastrophe of the purges had been multiplied tenfold by the catastrophe of invasion. And yet, the Soviet Union had not collapsed. The state still functioned. The army, though bloodied beyond anything previously imagined, still fought. The factories beyond the Urals still produced. Moscow still stood. What kept the Soviet Union alive through that first terrible winter? was not ideology or fear, or Stalin's brutality alone. It was something deeper and more paradoxical. The Soviet people discovered that they could endure what should not be endurable. They found that human beings possess reserves of resilience that only emerge when everything else has been stripped away. The women who worked 18-hour shifts in munitions factories, the engineers who rebuilt entire industrial complexes in the middle of Siberian winter, the soldiers who went into battle knowing they likely had no rifle until they could pick one up from a dead comrade, the civilians who survived on 400 grams of sawdust-laced bread per day in besieged Leningrad. None of these people were superhuman. They were ordinary human beings who discovered that ordinariness itself, when pushed to absolute limits, becomes extraordinary. The German Reich, conversely, discovered its limitations. The Wehrmacht remained a formidable fighting force, capable of brilliant tactical operations and devastating offensives. But the strategic foundation of Nazi Germany's war was revealed as hollow. The entire edifice rested on the assumption of quick victory, of enemies who would collapse after being defeated once. The German economy was not mobilized for total war. Consumer production continued at nearly peacetime levels through 1941. German women were not drafted into war work, while Soviet women operated tank factories. The racial ideology that declared Slavs subhuman prevented any possibility of collaborating meaningfully with conquered peoples who might otherwise have welcomed liberation from Stalin. Every assumption that had guided German planning was wrong, and the price of those errors would be paid across 4 more years of increasingly desperate combat. The battles around Moscow in winter 1941 changed the fundamental nature of World War II in Europe. Before Moscow, the war was a series of German victories and Allied retreats. After Moscow, the war became a struggle of attrition between 2 totalitarian systems, both willing to spend lives without limit to achieve their objectives. The question was no longer whether Germany could win quickly. The question was whether Germany could win at all, and whether the Soviet Union could survive long enough to grind down the German war machine. Through the spring and summer of 1942, the front stabilized into a pattern that would define the Eastern Front for the remainder of the war. Germany would launch massive offensives aimed at specific objectives: the Caucasus oil fields, the city of Stalingrad, the Kursk salient. These offensives would initially succeed, pushing deep into Soviet territory, inflicting enormous casualties, capturing important objectives. And then, inevitably, they would culminate. Soviet resistance would stiffen. German logistics would overextend. The Soviets would launch counteroffensives that would erase German gains and often push beyond them. With each cycle, German strength diminished, while Soviet strength, fed by American Lend-Lease and the relocated Soviet industrial base, grew. But none of that could have happened if Moscow had fallen in 1941. If Stalin's nerve had broken and the Soviet government had collapsed. If the German army had taken the Soviet capital and spent the winter in heated buildings rather than frozen foxholes. If the psychological impact of capturing the enemy capital had created the cascade of surrenders and defections that German planners had anticipated. The single most important fact of World War II in Europe is that none of those things happened. Moscow did not fall. And the cost of that victory, measured in Soviet blood, German defeat, and the redrawing of the entire post-war world, is still being calculated. The soldiers who fought that winter, on both sides, carried its memory for the rest of their lives. German veterans spoke of it in tones of horror mixed with disbelief. How could they have been so close, and yet so impossibly far? Soviet veterans remembered it as the moment they began to believe they might survive, might even win. Neither side could forget the cold, the absolute physical fact of frozen earth, and frozen flesh that made abstract concepts like strategy or ideology irrelevant compared to the immediate struggle to survive the night. In the decades after the war, military historians dissected the Battle of Moscow with professional precision, identifying every German error and Soviet success. Hitler's diversion to Kiev cost critical time. German intelligence underestimated Soviet reserves. The Wehrmacht's logistic system was inadequate for the distances involved. Soviet leadership, while brutal, maintained coherence when coherence should have been impossible. The arrival of Siberian divisions tipped the numerical balance at the critical moment. All true, all important, all insufficient to explain what actually happened. What happened at Moscow was not primarily a military event. It was a revelation about human nature and the dark mathematics of total war. It revealed that modern industrialized nations could sustain casualties that would have ended any previous war and continue fighting. That totalitarian systems, for all their inefficiency and brutality, could mobilize human resources in ways that democracies could not match without transforming themselves. That ideology, whether Nazi or Soviet, could motivate people to acts of extraordinary heroism and extraordinary cruelty, often simultaneously. That technology, while important, mattered less than will. That the calculus of victory in the 20th century was measured not in territory or battles won, but in the capacity to endure suffering. The Reich never recovered from Moscow. Not immediately. German armies would capture Sevastopol and drive to the Volga and the Caucasus in 1942. Not obviously. German tank production would actually peak in 1944. But the fundamental trajectory was set in that winter of 1941. Germany was fighting a war it could not win against an enemy it had awakened, but could not destroy. Every subsequent offensive was an attempt to break out of the trap that had closed at Moscow. Every tactical victory pushed Germany closer to strategic exhaustion. The slow arithmetic of attrition, temporarily balanced at Moscow, would grind on until the Soviet flag flew over the ruins of Berlin. For the Soviet Union, the price of survival was almost too terrible to justify, except that the alternative was extinction. 27 million Soviet citizens would die before the war ended. Cities would be erased. Villages would vanish entirely, their populations murdered or deported. The demographic catastrophe would echo through generations. A vast cohort of young men simply gone, leaving demographic scars visible in Soviet census data decades later. The psychological trauma would shape Soviet culture and politics for the remainder of the Soviet Union's existence. Victory, when it finally came, would taste of ashes mixed with blood. Yet Moscow stood. Through the worst winter of the 20th century, through bombardment and fear, and the knowledge that the most powerful army in the world stood at the gates, Moscow endured. Not because of grand strategy or brilliant leadership, but because millions of ordinary people made the daily choice to continue existing, to work another shift, to fight another day, to survive another night. The spires of the Kremlin, visible through German binoculars in December 1941, would remain Soviet through 4 more years of the most destructive war in human history. When the snow melted in spring 1942, it revealed the true cost of what had been purchased. Thousands of frozen corpses emerged from snowdrifts, German and Soviet alike, locked in postures of combat or flight or simple exhaustion. The earth around Moscow was scarred with trenches and bomb craters, littered with destroyed vehicles and abandoned equipment. The forests were stripped bare, every tree cut for fuel or fortification. The villages that had stood between Moscow and the German advance were gone, burned by one side or the other, their populations dead or dispersed. But Moscow lived. Factories continued producing. Trains still arrived from the east, carrying troops and supplies. The metro stations that had served as bomb shelters resumed carrying passengers. Life, that stubborn human insistence on continuing, despite all reason to surrender, persisted. The war would grind on for 3.5 more years. Stalingrad would become legend. Kursk would be the greatest tank battle ever fought. The siege of Leningrad would claim more lives than any single battle. But all of that was possible only because Moscow did not fall in 1941. In the final accounting, the Battle of Moscow was not won by any single factor, but by an accumulation of circumstances, decisions, and human qualities, both noble and terrible. Soviet brutality kept armies fighting that might otherwise have fled. German arrogance prevented adaptation, when adaptation might have saved the offensive. Winter came early and stayed late. Stalin proved more ruthless than Hitler anticipated. German logistics collapsed under the weight of distance and weather. Fresh Soviet divisions arrived from Siberia at the critical moment. Hitler's stand-fast order prevented retreat from becoming rout, but guaranteed maximum casualties. Ordinary Soviet citizens endured conditions that should have broken them and continued functioning. Ordinary German soldiers fought with professional excellence even as their strategic position became hopeless. No novelist would write such a story because it lacks the clean causality that fiction requires. No screenwriter would structure it this way because there is no moment where the outcome pivots on a single decision or action. The Battle of Moscow was won and lost across thousands of small decisions, hundreds of tactical engagements, millions of individual acts of endurance or failure. It was vast and chaotic and resistant to simple explanation, which is perhaps why it remains less famous in Western memory than Stalingrad or D-Day, despite being arguably more decisive than either. The legacy of Moscow extended far beyond the immediate military consequences. It demonstrated to the Western Allies that the Soviet Union would not collapse, that Hitler faced a two-front war he could not win, that time was now on the side of the alliance against Germany. It encouraged resistance movements across occupied Europe, providing proof that the Wehrmacht could be defeated. It began the transformation of the Red Army from a blunt instrument into an increasingly sophisticated military force that would eventually conduct offensive operations rivaling anything the Wehrmacht had achieved. For the German Reich, Moscow marked the beginning of the end, though that end would require 4 more years of increasingly desperate combat. The Eastern Front would consume the majority of German military resources for the remainder of the war. The brutal calculus of trading space for time, of fighting withdrawal battles designed to delay rather than win, of making last stands in ruined cities, all of this began at Moscow. The German army that invaded the Soviet Union in 1941 was perhaps the finest military instrument ever created. The German army that emerged from the winter of 1941–1942 was diminished, traumatized, increasingly skeptical of its leadership, and locked into a war that could only end in defeat or mutual annihilation.